Great, good morning. My name is Cristina Rodriguez. I am excited to be with DCAN for about 3 years, pretty close to a year after they started. I started working there, but I was able to volunteer with them for a couple of years before, so I'm really proud to be part of the Central Minnesota Dementia Community Action Network. I'm not just saying this because it's part of what I do, but if you haven't heard about us, we do some pretty cool things, right? And so I'm excited that all of you are here today. You can maybe learn a little bit more about us at our table, but hopefully you'll also get some information for the journey of being a caregiver when you have somebody living with dementia. Okay, so as Sin had said, I'm going to chat a little bit about understanding behaviors, and also once we know why a behavior might happen, oftentimes the next question that people ask me is, well, what do I do? How do I respond? Like, thanks for telling me why it's happening, but what do I do, right? So we're gonna go a little bit over that. So our objectives for today are to learn why behaviors or expressions may happen with dementia. I just wanna take a moment to say a little thing about behaviors. Oftentimes the word behavior can have kind of a negative thought process with it. So I do also like the word expressions, right? Because somebody that we love with dementia might be expressing something to us, and we shouldn't always assume that that's a behavior, right? All right, so then we're going to get a better understanding of how to respond to these dementia behaviors or expressions. Through this morning, I'm going to answer, these are 3 of the most common questions that I have been asked in nearly 25 years of experience working with individuals with dementia or their caregivers. So one of my first questions that I hear quite often is, why does a person living with dementia hide or misplace things and then assume or accuse others of stealing them? Right? Another question that we're going to talk about is, why does a person living with dementia look for somebody from their past? This is often somebody who maybe has passed away, and they're looking for somebody from their past. Right? So the third question that I get asked also quite a bit is, why doesn't a person living with dementia get more involved? So we're going to go through those questions, hopefully be able to answer some of those questions, but also give you some ways to respond if you find yourself in the situation of wondering any of these things. So first I want to talk about, what is a caregiver? So a caregiver is a general term referring to anyone who provides care for a person who needs extra help. Now the thing about dementia caregiving is that we don't always look at this very early stages of dementia as being a caregiver. Oftentimes, caregivers will tell me they're not caregivers because they're not providing physical cares, right? But the thing with dementia is that we might have to provide emotional care or cognitive care. It's not always physical. So that means that if you're helping anybody, you're considered a caregiver. So thank you for doing that. And I consider myself a caregiver. My grandmother is currently living with Alzheimer's type of dementia. She'll be 88 years old a little bit later this month. She has 5 children, 32 grandchildren, and up to about 23 great-grandchildren. They're all caregivers because we all do whatever we can when we go see our grandma to help, right? So we're all caregivers. All right, so it's good to be proactive rather than reactive. I have a caregiver who once came to a support group or to a meeting, and she said this specifically. I don't think she came up with it, but I am stealing it from her, right? And she said, I want to learn how to be proactive rather than reactive when my spouse goes through some dementia things. So we're going to talk a little bit about this for caregivers. Caregiving is often a very demanding job, and caregivers often express that they're frustrated. And oftentimes they're frustrated because dementia causes changes to a relationship, right? I think that the largest change happens in a spousal relationship. So when you go from being husband and wife and everything's 50-50 or however your relationship is set up, and then dementia comes, and now all of a sudden you're a caregiver. And not maybe 100%, a little 10% at first, and then as the disease progresses, you come more and more in that caregiving journey. And oftentimes, caregivers, they're frustrated because they didn't want this. You know, when they thought about their life goals and their marriage and everything that they were going to do, dementia was not in the cards, right? Another thing that I hear is caregivers also admit to feeling overwhelmed, frustrated, and exhausted on the caregiving journey, right? And many caregivers will come to me and they just say, I'm looking for more. So I'm looking for more grace. I hear that quite a bit. I'm looking for more grace. I'm looking for more patience. How do I have more patience? But also, I'm looking for more confidence, right? One of the second most common thing I hear from caregivers is, am I doing a good enough job? Right? So sometimes caregivers are just looking for that confidence that you really are doing okay. All right, so today I see a lot of familiar faces. Maybe some of you have heard me speak before, so you might hear some of the things that I've said before again today. That is completely intentional, right? Because oftentimes you might need to hear something more than once or twice, right? And then you start thinking, oh, maybe that'll work. A side note is a number of years ago, I did a support group, and I had a family that came to the support group for about a year. And then when their mom passed, they were very appreciative of me, and the one daughter said, I have to be honest, Cristina, I didn't believe a single thing you said for 6 months. And then it started making a little bit of sense, right? So if you feel like whatever you hear today is brand new, fantastic. If you feel like I've heard that before, that's okay, fantastic too. And if you feel like everything you hear today you are already doing, fantastic. Either way, I want to thank you for coming, because sometimes, I think especially with dementia, we might get stuck in, I'm only going to do it a certain way, right? But, as my slide says a little bit lower on here, keep in mind that nothing works every single time. I have never, in all of my 20 years of experience, came across something that works every time with every person. So it's good to know there are other options out there. I lost my clicker. All right, so as it says, if these tips and suggestions don't initially work, try them again, put them in your pocket to bring out later. These are intended to be tools, right? And oftentimes we have to use tools multiple times before we get good results. I definitely could not build a house with my first circular saw try, right? It would take some practice. So that is what this is intended for, is to give you ideas to put into practice. And remember that you're all doing a good job already, because you got here, so good job for that. All right, so my first question is, why does a person living with dementia hide or misplace things and then accuse others of stealing them? So you don't have to raise a hand, but if you would, has anybody in here ever been in that situation where they've had somebody who's like, hey, somebody's stealing stuff from me? All right, yep, so I got a couple. Thanks, that's good. So we're going to talk a little bit about how that happens. So I did write my notes down. I'm going to try to read, but that's really small. But it says it's common for people with dementia to experience delusions or strong false beliefs, which can also take a form of paranoia. Common delusions include theft or believing that loved ones are trying to harm them. So this can be a common thing with many dementias, is that individuals might have this tendency to hide or misplace things, and then they assume somebody stole them. Or they might even assume that somebody might be trying to harm them because of some of these delusions. But I do want to just share a little thing about the difference between hiding and misplacing. So it is commonly reported, and this is not for dementia patients, this is just a commonly report. It says it's commonly reported that the reasons for hiding objects are to prevent them from being discovered by others, being stolen, or being lost. So I'm going to say that the most of people in this room are relatively well-minded, meaning that we probably have most of our cognitive abilities with us. Has anybody ever hid anything? Maybe. All right. Has anybody ever had to think for a second or two about where you put it? Yeah, right. So welcome to normalcy, right? I think all of us do that. But when we're working with somebody living with dementia, we tend to think that that's a dementia thing. But we've probably all done something like that before, right? And now if we talk about misplacing, we use misplaced when we intentionally put something somewhere, but we can't find it right now. And it's common to misplace our phone, reading glasses, right? Some people combat that by just putting reading glasses in every room, right? You might misplace your keys. Now we say the key to that is, can you retrace your steps? So if I misplace something, can I think about where I put it and eventually go back to find it? So I just want to make sure we understand there is a difference between hiding stuff and misplacing stuff. And the reason why I bring this up is I had the opportunity to work with a gentleman caregiver and his wife living with dementia. And the gentleman came up to me and said, Cristina, what do we do about the mail? And I said, well, what do you mean, what do we do about the mail? And he said, every time she goes to get the mail, I watch her. She goes and she gets the mail, but as soon as she gets back in the house, she doesn't know where that mail goes. Right? And she said, he said, I asked her, we'll call her Barb, where'd you put the mail? Well, Barb says, I didn't do anything with it. And Carl says, I watched you walk in with the mail. Where did you put the mail? And it causes frustration for both. Right? And so through conversation, I'm explaining to this caregiver, I said, an individual living with dementia is not ignorant. They still have a lot of capabilities. And in his wife's case, she's fully capable of going to get the mail. She knows how to do that. She goes out, no problems, no issues. The problem comes in is when she gets into the house and she has this mail, and there's the water bill. And she's like, oh, God dang it, no, I know we got to do something with this water bill. But I can't quite think of it right now. So maybe some of you have done this, because I've done this. So I think, you know what? I'm going to set it right here, and I'm going to circle back to that later. Unfortunately, somebody living with dementia may have a difficult time circling back to that later. And now when her spouse comes and says, where did you put the mail? She's frustrated because he's coming with some, right? Because he says, she always loses the important stuff. It's probably because she knows it's important and is putting it somewhere, but then can't quite recall where she puts it. So we have this conversation, about what that could be like for this woman. And this woman with dementia says to her husband, and there's nothing I can do about it, but it makes it worse when you yell at me. Right? And so in this situation, the woman was misplacing something due to the dementia. Right? She's not hiding it. Her husband feels like she's hiding everything from him. She's not hiding. She's misplacing it. So one of the things that I did suggest for him is get a P.O. box, right? Send all of your important stuff to the P.O. box because she can and she is able to go get the mail. So Christmas cards, junk mail, anything else that comes in, that's fantastic. Let's not stop her from doing that. But I understand the frustration when taxes are overdue or the water bill doesn't get paid. Or one of my caregivers told me, I found a check that we got in the mail 8 years ago because it was misplaced, right? So we just want to talk a little bit about the difference between hiding and misplacing something, all right? So my first question that we're going to talk about is why do they hide things, right? And I want to use my water bottle here, like my vase. And I'm going to tell you a little story about how situations like this might happen. So I want you to pretend for just a moment that I'm an 80-year-old woman and I live independently. I have mild cognitive impairment or an early type of a dementia. And I do believe I've had the opportunity to work with a number of people with dementia. And I do believe that individuals in the early stages of dementia realize that something is happening. Something's going on, something's changing. But another really cool thing about our, kind of just how we all are, is that not a single one of us assume that we're the problem, right? That's part of, the joy is I'm not the problem, it must be somebody else. But if I'm living independently and I have dementia, or maybe I even have somebody who's living with me, but I have dementia, and I start to realize that stuff is not always where I put it, right? Now, because our kind of human response is to assume that I'm not the problem, it's somebody else, then we often get into this situation of hiding. So I'm an 80-year-old woman, I'm living independently by myself, and I have this beautiful vase. And I've had this vase, my husband Jason gave it to me years ago, and I've loved this vase. And I have 2 sons, and my daughter-in-law comes over and she says, "Oh, Ma, I know you love that vase. If we took that vase and we moved it right over here by the window, when the sun comes in, it's going to cast beautiful rainbows all over the room." And I'm like, oh my gosh, I love that. I love rainbows. That's a beautiful idea. I agree with it as a person living with dementia. And then my visit goes on, and it could be 5 minutes later, it could be an hour later, it could be 2 hours later, 2 days later. I walk into my kitchen, and my vase is not where it always is, right? Now again, I'm not the problem, right? What happens, though, when I come in and I see my vase is gone? Somebody's been breaking into my house, right? I hear that. People have been breaking into my house. I had one caregiver who told me that her mother used to hide all of her cookie sheets because she was concerned that the high school kids were coming in to take them, right? So not maybe necessarily a realistic thing, but regardless, as soon as I see that my vase is gone, my anxiety is probably heightened, right? My emotions are probably heightened. I might even feel scared. And then I'm walking and, oh my God, who in the world put my vase over here? I would never put my vase over here. It has always been right here. And then sometimes in dementia, I kind of chuckle at this because through all of my years, it is primarily the daughters that get blamed. And I don't know why. Probably because women are more likely to be caregivers, right? In my situation, it would be the daughter-in-law, right? And so me, with dementia, might have some recollection that my daughter-in-law had come to see me, and I might begin to spin this truth for me in my head, is that my daughter-in-law is trying to steal this vase because she compliments me every time she comes here. And she moved it closer to the door. It's like you knew what I was going to say, right? Because she's trying to take it, right? And so now I have this false delusion that my daughter-in-law is trying to take something from me. So what am I going to do? Yeah, you know what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this beautiful face that my husband gave me many years ago, and I'm going to go way, way back in the closet and put it in his really tall rubber boots. And that dang daughter-in-law of mine is not going to get it now. But what happens? 2 hours later, when I walk into my dining room and my vase is not here. You can see the cycle that we're starting there, right? And so this is a story to help us understand how these things happen, right? And one of the things that I want to mention here is that my grandmother, as I mentioned to you, is living with Alzheimer's. She now is in a care facility, but when she was living at home after my grandfather had passed, people would send money in the mail, right? Which is very nice. The problem is my grandma has dementia, and so the money would come in the mail, and she would put it someplace, and then she would hide it because it's cash that's coming in the mail. And then later, she would try to go find it, or somebody would send her more money, and she couldn't find it. What I bring this up for is that I had one uncle that every time he would go visit my grandmother, he would ask, "Have you found that money yet?" Right? So we don't want to do that. If somebody is in the moment and they're accusing or they're missing something, We want to be in that moment, and we want to live in that moment and help them through that. But if they've been looking for something for 2 hours, and then all of a sudden the doorbell rings or something, comes and distracts them, as a caregiver, do not bring up what they were looking for, right? Just let that subside. And I say that because my grandmother could be in a beautiful mood, and as soon as my Uncle Todd would come and ask her about that money, we would spend the next 2 hours looking for the money, right? And so how can we respond is that we can assist. We did come to find out with my grandmother that she really liked eyeglass cases, and she would put cash in eyeglass cases. So that was, at least for us, an easy thing to look for, is at least we know it's likely in an eyeglass case, right? In one of the books that we're going to give out a little bit later, mine is the Creating Moments of Joy. And one of the things that I do like about that book is that it gives simple, practical advice. And one of the ladies told the story in there about, there were two. One was about a baseball cap, and her husband or the gentleman was losing this baseball cap, or it was going missing. They just bought multiple of the same cap, right? Another lady always had a black purse, and she said, we didn't even have to buy the exact same purse. If it was a black purse, she was okay with that. So if it's a situation where it's sentimental value and it's a vase, I wouldn't suggest we can go out and buy all of these vases, right? But there are situations where we might be able to mediate this by just giving in to what it is they're looking for. Here's a black purse. Boy, I don't know how it got there, but here's one. We can use that today, type of thing, right? But we also want to validate those feelings. Because if somebody is feeling like somebody stole something from them, if I say to you, Nathan, Dr. Zook stole my vase. And if Nathan says to me, Christina, Dr. Zook would never do such a thing, does that make me believe Nathan? No, because I still feel harmed, right? And so what I don't want to do is to ignore, right? But instead I might say, oh my gosh, I know that was really important to you. You must feel kind of sad that we can't find it right now, but I'm sure it'll turn up, or I'll help you look for it, right? The last thing that we will ever be able to do is to convince somebody with dementia that they're the problem. If I tell Nathan, Dr. Zook stole my vase, and Nathan comes back with all these beautiful reasons why Dr. Zook would never do that, you know what it makes me think? Nathan's probably conspiring. They're going to have joint custody of my vase. Right? So by trying to convince somebody of our truth, it is likely to make you look crazy to them. Right? Oops, this way. So another thing that we might try to respond with is something called ambiguity or rephrasing. So if I said, Nathan, Dr. Zook took my vase, Nathan could respond by saying, Dr. Zook took your vase? All he did was rephrase what I said. It is amazing that if we rephrase and say something back to somebody that has been said to us, we repeat it back, it really gives the appearance and the belief that we're listening to somebody. So therefore, I'm being validated because Nathan's not now trying to tell me all of the things that Dr. Zook wouldn't have done. He's just saying, wow, so Dr. Zook took your vase. Right? Another thing is ambiguity. So with ambiguity, I might instead say, if somebody says, Dr. Zook took my vase, I might rephrase with ambiguity and say, he took your vase? Because I don't want to contribute to diminishing the beautiful reputation of Dr. Zook. So I might just use that ambiguity term of saying he took it, right? Because again, I'm just validating the feeling that they're telling me. I am not getting caught up on the actual words that are being used. And I think Dr. Zook has plenty of vases, so we're probably okay, right? And the other one is don't argue. Again, don't try to prove your point, right? You're gonna exhaust yourself, and you really can cause a little bit of harm in that relationship if this person starts to feel that you are not trustworthy, right? All right, so our next question is, why does a person living with dementia look for somebody from their past? So again, has anybody ever had this happen? Yeah, a couple of you have raised your hands. This also can be a pretty common thing. So a person living with dementia often looks for individuals from their past because the part of their brain responsible for storing long-term memories, I lost my place there. Particularly those from earlier in life, are often better preserved compared to our most recent memories, right? Many times I have said, I read a report a number of years ago that said most individuals with Alzheimer's type of dementia revert back to between the ages of 8 to 12. My personal thought on that is I think that it might be 8 to 19 or early 20s. And the reason why this is often important is because if we were to revert back to the age of 18, how many people are already married with kids at the age of 18? Some, maybe, but not many. So this also helps us to explain why sometimes individuals with dementia don't know who their spouse is. Because if they're reverting back to these earlier stages in their life, they may not be married. And again, you're going to look a little crazy if you try to convince me in my mind of maybe being 18, 17 years old that I'm married with 2 kids. Because in my mind, I'm not, right? Because of this dementia, it has taken me back to that stage. So we're going to again talk a little bit about what does this look like. So for this story, I'm going to use something that I learned a number of years ago from Dementia Friends of Minnesota. So maybe some of you are already Dementia Friends of Minnesota and you've heard this story. But I like how the bookcase story helps us to understand why somebody could be looking for somebody who has passed away. So we're talking years back, right? They're no longer living. So again, you get to imagine me as all kinds of things today. I want you to imagine me now that I'm an 85-year-old woman and I have dementia. And standing next to me is this large, beautiful bookcase. Now, this bookcase, you'll notice, is filled from top to bottom. If you look close enough, you'll notice on the top shelf of my bookshelf, it's rather thin magazine or pamphlet type of books. But as you look lower on my bookshelf, you'll also notice that some of the books on the bottom are thicker and much more substantial. Many people in here, maybe you even had Encyclopedia Britannicas. Those are the books on the bottom, right? Those big, thick books. So here I am, and standing next to me is this bookshelf, and all of a sudden, dementia comes upon me. I have dementia. And what dementia does to this bookshelf is it causes this bookshelf to sway back and forth, almost like an earthquake is going on. So if my bookshelf is swaying back and forth, which books are going to be the first books to fall off of the shelf? Somebody said at the top, right? Those lighter pamphlet type of books. Now it's important to know that this bookshelf is chronological order of my life. So when dementia comes, my first memories that go are my earliest, my most recent, memories. This might be, I'll pick on somebody else. Mary Jane, what did you have for breakfast this morning? A banana, right? Good job. That's a top shelf memory, right? That's a memory of something that just happened. So it's pretty recent. Now, as we go down this bookshelf, it's my chronological order of my life. So as this earthquake of dementia continues to shake, I'm going to lose more and more of my books, right? Now, if you look at my book and you have, the first 3 bookshelves have some books, but they're kind of toppled over and they're not nice and they're not neat. But there's a big old pile of books here on the floor. Now I'm going to ask you a realistic question. If you go to the library and you need to pick a book, any book, are you going to pick a book off of the pile of the floor books, or are you going to pick a book that's still nicely housed in the bookshelf? Most folks are shaking your head like I think you would probably go to the book that is nicely housed in the bookshelf. Yep. Well, in dementia, those books that are nicely housed in the bookshelf still are probably somebody in their 20s, in their teens, in their early years, which is often why we will hear caregivers say, oh, my loved one can't remember what we did last night, but they could sure tell me what happened 45 years ago, right? That's because their books from the last 45 years are in a big old pile on the floor right here. As I said before, individuals with dementia are not ignorant. It doesn't mean they don't know this information down here. What it means is that it's not in the normal spot, that it has normally been our entire life. I could go to my bookshelf and pull out a memory. But now dementia has come upon me, and my memories are not beautifully housed in my bookshelf any longer in a good order, right? But you'll notice that the books that are on the bottom here, and so I'm going to go back a bit and just share. I think maybe my next slide actually does that. So I want to talk about that top shelf, as I said, is those most recent memories, kind of today, tomorrow, yesterday, what happened. That middle shelf is going to be our young adult or middle-aged years. So sometimes I might have individuals that I work with who have some memory of raising children, of what it was like raising their children. But oftentimes as the disease progresses, the memories become much more vivid and alert for them in their younger years. For my case with my grandmother, I test this when I go visit her. And I'm Cristina, but I go by Chrissy in my family. And so I go see my grandma, and I say, hey, Grandma, it's Chrissy. Now, earlier in her disease, she would connect with that. And she would say, hey, Chrissy, how are you? Now, as the disease progresses, she's not necessarily connecting with that. She's Grandma, I'm Chrissy. I'll still say it, and about 10 minutes into our visit, she'll say, now who are you? And I say, I'm Cristina, and then I ask her, what can I call you? Because she's already indicated to me when I called her grandma that she does not see me as her grandchild, because she did not acknowledge that. So she asks me, who am I? I'm Cristina, what can I call you? And she'll say, Hazel. Right? That's another clear indicator to me that she doesn't see herself as my grandmother because she's calling me, telling me to call her Hazel. So we'll go on and visit a little bit, and she'll ask me where I'm from, and then she'll say, and who are you? And I'll say, I'm Cristina Rodriguez. And she'll say, oh, okay. And I'll say, and who are you? And she'll say, Hazel. And this is where I tell which shelf my grandma's on, because then I'll say, Hazel who? And if she tells me Hazel Yoder, because that's my maiden name, she married my grandfather at 18, I know in her mind's eye, in that bookshelf, she's 18 or older. But more than likely, in the past number of months to a year, she's told me that her name is Hazel Lauji. That's her maiden name. So if I turn around and ask her to tell her about her husband, Dale, she just told me she's not married yet. She has no kids. Right? So that's a great way for me to kind of check and gauge, where is my grandma on this journey? Because I want to meet her wherever she is. So if she's telling me about her mom, and she hasn't seen her mom in a long time, you haven't, Grandma. She passed away when you were 19. Right? So it's been some time since her mom's been around. But what I can do, well, I'm going to tell you in a minute what I can do, because I do want to mention here our lower shelves. So with our lower shelves, it is important to realize those really thick books that I told you are on the bottom of the shelf, that is where we house our earliest learned and childhood memories, which is why that stays around longer. It is also where we house our emotions and our morals. And sometimes morals from years past might be a little different than our morals from today. And so sometimes individuals may say things that were maybe not always appropriate, but more acceptable to say 40 or 50 years ago that are not as acceptable to say now, right? Because they're in this younger stage in their brain, right? This is in their childhood. It's also where we house our beliefs for religion. I have worked with a number of people locally here who have transitioned or become Catholic, but they were not born into a Catholic religion. So as they age, they have no interest in going to Mass. Boy, does that tick some family members off, right? But because if they were raised as a Protestant, why the heck would I go to Mass? Right? So it's important for us to kind of realize and take a look at what are these earlier memories. The other thing that's important to realize right here is our first learned language. As I mentioned, I'm a Rodriguez by marriage, right? But my husband was born in Puerto Rico. His first language is Spanish. He can speak both Spanish and English, but his first learned language, or his mother tongue, is Spanish. So if my husband were to develop a dementia, chances are very likely that eventually his cognitive or his vocal abilities would go back to Spanish, because that was his first learned language. This is also important when we talk about, we all call things different. In one of our presentations that we do, I ask people to name how many different names can you come up with for mayonnaise, right? There's about 5, that we can come up with. There's Miracle Whip, mayo, mayonnaise, salad dressing, spread, right? So if I grew up in a Miracle Whip family, and I always call it Miracle Whip, and you want to serve me dressing or mayo, I might not fully understand that that's the same thing, because I'm going back to what I first learned, right? So it's important to keep that in mind. When somebody's looking for somebody from their past, it is because they are in that area of the dementia, right? Their bookshelf is all kind of jacked up right now, and they're going to the shelf that is put together. They're looking for safety on that shelf, and when they get to that book, it's a memory of their mom. And so now somebody's looking for their mother, right? So how do we respond to this, or what don't we do? Is we're going to stay in their reality, right? I am not going to reality orient anybody. I have, and if somebody comes out right and asks me, boy, did my mom die? I'm not going to lie. But if somebody's looking for their mother who has passed, I am not going to say your mom has passed. Right? Instead, I'm going to again try to talk about that emotion that is attached to why they're looking for their mom. Oftentimes, individuals look for people from their past for a couple of reasons. One is because they don't know where they are. Something doesn't look familiar. Now, my grandmother has lived in this same facility for 3 years. Nothing has changed. But that doesn't mean that she realizes that that's her home. She's looking for something that's comfortable for her. So she looks for her mom. I never had the opportunity to meet my grandmother's mother, whose name was also Hazel, but my grandmother has shared stories with me. So when she's looking for Hazel, her mother, I will say, oh, tell me about her. What was one of the best things about your mom? And my grandmother will tell me oftentimes that my great-grandmother could play music by ear and would play the piano, and my grandma will go on to share how her parents made her play the piano, and she didn't really learn it because she didn't want to, but now she regrets that, right? But she'll tell me that story, so I'm helping her with that feeling of, where is my mom? I can't take her to her mom, right? But I can talk about that. I can talk about, tell me about your mom, right? What was your mom like? Now, I might also say I'm going to use some opposite or extreme questions. So if somebody came up to me and said, have you seen my husband? And I'm not sure, they have dementia, so I haven't seen their husband. And I might say something like, boy, it's, 9:30 maybe-ish on a Thursday morning. Where do you think he would be? So I'm not degrading the question of where is my husband. I am saying, where do you think he might be? And I've had this question, and I've asked it, and I've had the response of, oh, he's probably at the bar, right? So now I get to ask an extreme or opposite question, which is he always at the bar? Right? Was there ever a time that he's not at the bar? Now, I'm not trying, I do occasionally get people who ask me if I'm writing a story about them with all my questions. That's not my intent. My intent is to help walk them through this emotion, right? Because often, like I said, they could be fearful of where they are, what's going on. And by just being able to say, well, let's talk about it, right? Where do you think he'd be right now? What's the best thing about him? But we do have to be careful with the response. I had worked in a care facility and I had this happen where I had a woman who, we were finishing up lunch and we had spaghetti for lunch that day, and she's walking around to the tables of the other residents and she's saying, have you seen my husband? Have you seen my husband? Have you seen my husband? And they're all saying no, and she comes up to a staff and the staff is a little frustrated because they've heard this question multiple times. And they say, oh, he went to the store, he'll be right back, right? Now, immediately, this woman starts to take her clothes off in the middle of the dining room. And the staff is kind of like, oh my gosh, what's going on? So they get her to her apartment. And later I reach out a little bit to the daughter because I'm like, yeah, that was a little unusual for that type of thing to happen. And the daughter shared with me, her husband was, I believe he was in the community. I think he was a doctor, but I don't quite recall. But either way, they were always prestigious. They always looked good. They had their stuff pulled together, right? But that day, we had spaghetti, and she had gotten spaghetti on her top. And so she's walking around frantically looking for her husband because she's got to get this taken care of. But because of dementia, it doesn't quite come out like that, right? And so then all of a sudden, the staff said, oh, he'll be right back. Well, you could just see the fear on this woman's face because the daughter shared with me that sometimes he wasn't always very nice. And so now this woman has got this fear that her husband just went to the store and he's on his way back, right? So we want to be careful when we kind of tell those little white lies because we want to know what is the feeling associated with the question. We also want to try to stay away from obvious questions. Obvious questions are questions we know the answers to. My father does this to my grandmother quite a bit. He'll go visit and he'll say, Mom, because that's what he calls her, Mom, tell me how many kids you had. And my grandma will begin to list off her siblings, right? And my dad will say, no, your kids. And one day I was there when he did that and we got in the elevator and I said, what the heck was that? And he said, well, I'm trying to get her to remember. And I said, well, it doesn't work like that. Because I could see the frustration of my grandma trying to put together what were these answers, and he was just relentless. And I turned to him in the elevator and I said, Dad, you're one of her kids. You know all of her kids. Don't ask her to tell you something you already know the answer to. Don't ask obvious questions. All right, so our next one is, why does a person living with dementia, why do they not get more involved? Sometimes a person living with dementia will stop taking part in activities that they used to enjoy. Sometimes they just pull back, sometimes they stop altogether. And oftentimes this might be because they realize that something is a little different. Things are changing, and they might not feel super confident in their abilities, right? And none of us want to feel like we don't know what we're doing. All right, so before I tell you my story about this one, I do want to mention a little bit about communication, because communication really is so important to keeping our individuals with dementia engaged. But it is also important to realize there are a number of steps that are required for communication. We often think the only step is hearing. It is a step. We do need to hear, but an individual living with dementia needs to be able to hear that question. They need to be able to comprehend what is being said or what is being asked. They have to be able to reason enough to come up with an answer. And it's a beautiful, almost volley back and forth in the brain to make that happen. And if an individual living with dementia has an area of the brain that has some damage done to it, communication can be even more difficult. For an individual living with dementia, it may take 7 to 20 seconds for somebody to hear, comprehend, formulate a response, and get that response to come out of their mouth. I've talked a lot. You've already listened to me for 40 minutes, right? 7 to 20 seconds is a long time. And oftentimes, we fall into this of if somebody doesn't answer me right away, we just talk louder, right? And so now I'm shouting at them, and they're still having a hard time comprehending. So chances are now they're not even going to want anything to do with me because I'm yelling at them, right? And then I want to talk just a little bit about body language. So body language is an interesting thing because of everything with our communication, 7% of my communication this morning is words. That's it, only 7%. So that's the words I'm reading or the words that I'm saying. 38% of our communication is done through tone of voice. Many of us understand the differences of tone of voice, and it's likely that we learned the difference in tone of voice in our childhood, right? So that means an individual living with dementia, because those earliest learned behaviors and experiences stick around, they will be able to pick up if you have a little bit of a harsh tone of voice. They also will be able to pick up if we have a high-pitched, shrieky voice, right? Because sometimes I will see individuals who will speak with somebody with dementia and they just raise their octaves, right? So 7% is our words, 38% is our tone of voice. That leaves 55% of our communication is nonverbal, right? So for just a moment, I have to set this down. For those of you that can see me up here, how many of you, men or women, would willingly want to go to somebody who's standing like this? Now, how about, you see my foot, if I'm doing this? Right. And how about this one? Right, not so much. I'm sorry, women, we tend to be a little bit harsher on the body language. And a lot of women, and I'm sorry, I kind of do this too, stand like this. Right? You kind of stand like that. And although we may not mean anything by it, for an individual living with dementia who can still read our body language, I might not look approachable, right? And especially if I say somebody who might have some hearing loss, and this person may or may not know who I am because their dementia might make it a little bit uncertain for them who I am. And then there's a woman who's raising their voice, who's got their hand on their hips, and who's shaking their feet, right? And I jokingly ask men, how many men want to get up and go to a woman like that, right? But realistically, how many women want to get up and go to a woman like that, right? I will say that one time I asked that question and a gentleman said, well, if you've got food, yeah, I'll come. Right? And we all have probably heard this multiple times. Maya Angelou once said that I've learned that people will forget what you've said, people will forget what you've done for them, but people will never forget how you make them feel. This is important as we go throughout today to keep in mind that those feelings stick around a long time in the dementia journey. All right, so for bingo, I wanted to share a story about a family that reached out to me and said, my loved one's not participating in bingo. So I went and I watched to see what was going on. And my mic only lets me pick on this table, so sorry, ladies. So I'm going to pretend for one moment that Tina is my woman that I'm watching. Now, the family said to me, Mom used to go to bingo all the time. She doesn't go to bingo anymore. Can you go and watch and see? And I said, okay. And I observed, and what I observed is I watched Tina come to the bingo table, and at this assisted living that I was at, they had to pay with quarters. So Tina, who we'll say had a form of a dementia, comes to the table, and she goes to sit down, and Annette says, Tina, you need quarters. You need quarters to play. So Tina's like, oh, that's right. So she goes back to her apartment, which was pretty close to the room that they were playing bingo. And I watched her walk to her apartment, and she got to her door, and you could kind of see that she struggled for a moment. I think she wasn't quite sure what she went back to her door for. But she went in, and 2 minutes later, a staff person came and knocked on her door and said, Tina, it's time for bingo. Now, at this time, that staff person should have made sure she had quarters, but they didn't. And Tina's only been gone for just a moment. And then she comes back. And now she comes to this table who recalls her just being there. And now Mary Jane stands up and says, well, if Tina's not playing for bingo, I'm not paying for bingo either. And makes kind of a big scene about it, right? And now what happens is this dear Tina kind of just sulked back to her apartment. And when the daughter called later and said, well, Mom, did you play bingo? She said, no, I'm never good at it anyways, right? But then she called and she asked me, she said, Cristina, tell me, what did you see? And I told her about what I saw. And I said, the thing is, right, I bet you that now Tina is like, you know what, I'm afraid I might do it wrong, so I don't want to do it at all, right? And so what can we do is we can be aware and mindful of this. What does this environment look like when we're encouraging and inviting people to come and participate in events? We have a great respite downstairs today, and part of that reason is sometimes a room full of people can be overwhelming, especially for a person with dementia. It could also be that they might be worried that they don't recall who people are, right? So let's be mindful of what do these environments look like. We also don't want to assume that somebody can or can't do something. I have a caregiver who's like, oh, my husband can't do that. He's like a 2-year-old. And I say, I bet you that he could do some things, right? So we don't want to assume that somebody can or can't do something. And I like here it says set up for success, positively manipulate the situation. That is my favorite thing to do, is positively manipulate situations so they are successful. So my lady with the bingo, I went to the activity department and I said, hey, can you go invite Tina to help at the table with the folks who are early memory loss? They gave Tina a little pointer. She would sit at the table and she'd point to all the bingo cards to I-17 or G-56. Now, Tina didn't play bingo anymore, but that was okay because she liked the job of helping. So she came and she got engaged even though it was different than what she had done in the past. So we always want to encourage people to continue to contribute. Sometimes they can't contribute maybe how they used to, but I did have a caregiver share a story with me recently and said, I brought my husband with me to do some volunteering. It wasn't anything overly difficult, but he volunteered. And she said, it was only about an hour and a half of volunteering, but man, he talked about it for 2 days. And she said, we've tried to do volunteering in the past and it's not always successful, but this time it was. And boy, was that exciting for him, right? He talked about it for 2 days. We want to continue to invite. I have a caregiver who told me, I can't tell you how sad I was that we belonged to a card group for 20 years, and my husband has dementia, and last week they asked us to stop coming, right? Because his abilities have changed. I'm here to tell everybody, we are well-minded, we can change too, right? If somebody's living with dementia and they need to do something a little bit different, I can guarantee you that we all got dressed this morning, because I can see that, but none of us did it in the exact same way. But at the end of the day, we're all dressed, right? So if we need to make some changes, that's all right. Let's make some changes because it's important for individuals to still feel like they can be involved. We want, as a human nature, to feel wanted and to feel useful, right? And the other thing down here is feelings last, as we've already talked about a bunch this morning. Nobody wants to feel ashamed, unworthy, or unable to contribute, period. We all want to feel like we are worthy and can contribute. All right, so the last thing, because they're telling me I got just about 5 minutes left. The last thing that I want to leave you with, and some of you have maybe heard me say this, because if you've ever heard me speak before, I say this one nearly every single time. And that's because I really like it. So I'm going to talk about what's the difference between remember and recall. Right? So they mean pretty much the same thing. If I were to look them up in the dictionary, they're rather similar meanings. But socially, the word remember has this negative attachment. If we don't remember something, we as a society feel that's bad. Right? And I read somewhere that said if you were ever in the court of law, your lawyer would likely encourage you to use the word recall rather than remember. Because recall means, well, I don't know right now, but it'll come to me, right? But if you don't remember, that sounds so negative. And I might say to Dr. Zook, where were you May 2nd, 1982? And if Dr. Zook says, I don't remember, right? Somebody may, when we talk about remember, again, it's got this negative kind of attachment to it. And somebody might say, well, why don't you remember? What were you doing that you wouldn't remember? Dr. Zook, were you drinking? Right? No, probably not. But the point is, remember can sound so negative if we don't remember it. But if we say recall, it really sounds nicer. We could just leave it at that. Recall sounds nicer. But the reason why I also like recall is that I told you earlier, let's not ask obvious questions. But sometimes obvious questions happen. And if I were to say to somebody, I say to my grandmother, Hazel, what was your husband's name? Now I know this, but nobody's perfect. And sometimes we still ask questions. And Hazel might be having a hard time coming up with who her husband is. But I can say, oh, my gosh, Hazel, you have told me so many times, but I don't recall right now either. It'll come to us later. And that makes us feel a little bit better because we're in the same boat that we don't recall. It's not the same boat of not remembering. And my family has been on my journey for a number of years with me, so much that it's almost a joke. Hardly anybody says remember. We all say recall, which I think is beautiful because it does sound a little bit nicer too. Okay, that is the end of my time. I'm done, so thank you very much. I appreciate your time this morning.